The number one priority for Canada's forestry industry is, of course, getting rid of Trump's punishing tariffs.
Some in the industry, though, would like to find new buyers for Canada's top-grade lumber in China, Japan, and in Europe. One big problem, though, Asian and European home builders work off the metric system.
Trump's tariffs have pushed Canada's lumber industry into something nobody expected: a forced shift into the metric system.
Opportunities in India, opportunities in Vietnam, South Korea, and it can be in the case of Japan. Japan wants high quality. We have some mills that have retooled specifically for a Japanese customer.
And here's the real twist. The very tariffs Washington designed to punish Canadian lumber are now tightening a noose around America's own construction sector. While Canada adapts, recalibrates, and prepares for global markets, the United States is grappling with soaring home building costs and a sudden reliance on foreign timber and makes absolutely no strategic sense. This isn't just another Canada-US trade story. It's a moment that reveals how political theater in Washington can unintentionally destabilize the backbone of the North American economy, and how Canada, under a far more calculated approach, is turning crisis into long-term opportunity.
The story begins with a quirk of history. Canada officially adopted the metric system in the 1970s, but its lumber mills continued cutting wood in inches and feet. There was no reason to change when nearly 90% of Canadian softwood was destined for the United States, a country firmly committed to the imperial system. It was a commercial relationship that worked for decades, until 2025. When Donald Trump returned to the White House and reignited his tariff agenda, Canadian softwood lumber became an early target. Duties now exceed 45%, hitting spruce, pine, and fir, the essential building materials that support both countries' housing markets. The impact in Canada was immediate. Layoffs across British Columbia and Alberta, temporary mill closures, and a scramble within the sector to rethink its export strategy. Industry representatives appearing before Parliament described the same pattern. The U.S. could no longer be treated as a stable or predictable market. Opportunities were emerging in Japan, South Korea, India, Vietnam, and the European Union. But all these markets use the metric system and enforce precise measurement standards. To reach them, Canadian mills must retool equipment costing up to $2 million, with delivery timelines stretching as long as 3 years. Switching to metric won't happen overnight. It's expensive, time-consuming, and disruptive. But it also represents a turning point, a chance for Canada to reposition itself in global supply chains, rather than remain locked inside a market increasingly defined by political risk. And while Canada begins this transition, the United States is discovering a much harsher truth. The loss of Canadian lumber is already shaking its own construction sector. The most striking reality beneath this dispute is simple. The U.S. needs Canadian lumber far more than Canada needs American tariffs. Reuters has reported significant cost increases for U.S. home builders, triggered directly by the shortage of Canadian imports. Bloomberg has likewise noted an uncomfortable detail. Russian lumber is now cheaper for American buyers than Canadian wood. But while the price may seem appealing on paper, relying on Russia or Scandinavia cannot match the volume, consistency, or environmental standards that Canada has supplied for decades. Across states like Texas, Michigan, Washington, and Ohio, builders are warning that homes are becoming more expensive, project timelines are growing longer, and supply delays are becoming routine. Lumber prices in the U.S. have jumped by double digits since summer. These are not marginal shifts. They represent structural pressure on an industry that already faces high interest rates and affordability crises. So the question becomes unavoidable. Did these tariffs strengthen America's position, or did they sabotage the very sector they were supposed to protect? Canada, meanwhile, is not panicking. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the government is leaning into a long-term diversification strategy that aligns perfectly with what the lumber industry now requires. If Canada must convert its entire production system to metric, then that investment should not simply patch a problem, it should open new, durable export pathways into Asia and Europe. Japan's premium housing market demands high-grade lumber, and Canada's SPF is an ideal fit. South Korea's booming construction sector is hungry for dependable supply. India's urban expansion represents one of the largest growth markets on the planet. Vietnam's furniture industry, built on export-driven manufacturing, is rapidly expanding. And Europe, with its strict but high-value timber standards, remains one of the most lucrative markets globally. Trump wanted to isolate Canada. Instead, he has accelerated Canada's evolution into a truly global supplier, one that is no longer tethered to a single buyer or vulnerable to political mood swings in Washington. It is the exact kind of structural realignment Carney has advocated since taking office. There is also a deeper irony at play. Canada is modernizing its industrial base, updating machinery, improving standards, and aligning with the measurement system used by the vast majority of the world. Meanwhile, the United States is drifting further into trade protectionism, absorbing higher domestic costs and, in some cases, turning to Russian imports simply because they are cheaper under Trump's tariff regime. The image is unmistakable. Canada is moving forward. America is moving inward. Politically, tariffs make great headlines. They energize Trump's base, trigger applause at rallies, and offer the simplest possible narrative: America fights back. But the real economics do not care about the theatrics. The real economics tell us that the U.S. construction sector cannot function without steady flows of Canadian lumber, not now, not in 5 years, not even in a decade. And this brings us to the next flashpoint, the USMCA renegotiation in 2026. If Trump's tariffs already destabilized one of the most integrated supply chains in North America, what will happen when the entire trade agreement is reopened? Canada is preparing from a position of clarity. Its industries are diversifying, its reliance on the U.S. is shrinking, and its strategic leverage is increasing precisely because American consumers are feeling the pain of protectionism. For the first time in many years, Canada enters a U.S. trade dispute not as the smaller partner hoping for relief, but as a country actively redesigning its economic future.
Trump's tariffs were meant to wound Canada. Instead, they triggered a transformation. The Canadian lumber industry now stands at the threshold of global expansion, equipped with new standards, new partners, and new markets. It will take time and investment, but it is a path toward greater independence and resilience, the exact qualities Prime Minister Carney has championed since day one. Meanwhile, the United States is absorbing the consequences of its own strategy. Rising construction costs, unstable supply chains, and a growing reliance on foreign timber are becoming the new normal. The lumber war, once framed as a political victory, is revealing something more fundamental. North America's economic balance is shifting, and not in the direction Washington intended. As Canada prepares for the 2026 USMCA showdown, one question lingers. If the tariffs designed to weaken Canada end up strengthening its global position while driving up costs for American families, then who is truly winning this trade war?
Have those discussions, and then if a good deal is there, yes, we will sign it. But if it's not there, we're not going to sign a bad deal. What I would say to Canadians, the good news is virtually everybody wants to do more with Canada because we have what the world wants. We have the values to which most of the world aspires. We're a reliable partner.
In a year-end interview, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a calm but pointed message that dismantled the core assumptions behind Donald Trump's trade strategy. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't posture, he didn't attack. He simply laid out, point by point, a picture of a Canada that is stronger, more independent, and far less vulnerable to Washington's pressure than Trump has claimed for 2 years. By the end, one message hovered over the entire conversation. Canada is done playing defense in Trump's trade war. The country is now steering the pace, and Trump can't dictate the terms anymore.
So that's true in Asia, whether it's the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, the ASEAN countries, which are almost a quarter of the world's GDP. It's Indonesia, it's the European Union, it's the UK, it's the countries of the Gulf. United Arab Emirates is going to invest $70 billion, $70 billion in Canada. They've made a commitment to that. They made the commitment. We didn't ask, that comes. So people want to do more with Canada.
The interview took place in a setting rich with symbolism, the Canadian Museum of History, surrounded by stories of identity, sovereignty, and nationhood. It immediately grounded the audience in the scale of the moment. This wasn't just a political check-in, it was a status report on a country undergoing a rapid transformation. Carney came into office following a snap election triggered by Justin Trudeau's resignation, a moment that plunged Ottawa into uncertainty just as Washington escalated tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, and nearly every major Canadian export sector. Trump's hope was simple: overwhelm a new prime minister before he finds his footing. But 8 months later, Carney sat confidently in front of the camera, not only unfazed by the trade war, but using it to rewire Canada's economic and strategic direction. He confirmed that formal negotiations with Washington have not begun, and he made no apology for the delay. Canada, he explained, becomes stronger every week negotiations don't happen. The economy is stabilizing, investment is flowing, and new international partnerships are forming faster than at any point in the last decade. Trump may believe time is on America's side, but Carney made it clear that in this confrontation, time strengthens Canada, not the United States. Then came the line that defined the interview. Carney said plainly, the United States is no longer a reliable partner. The quiet confidence of that statement carried more weight than any dramatic confrontation could. Trump has spent years insisting Canada is dependent, boxed in, and ultimately powerless in the face of American market dominance. Yet Carney's interview dismantled that assumption without ever mentioning Trump by name. His analysis of the past 8 months revealed a Canada that has diversified its economic ties, strengthened its domestic industries, and cultivated new sources of investment at a pace Washington never accounted for. The subtext was unmistakable. A country with options cannot be intimidated, and Canada now has more options than at any point in its modern trade history. Trump's core mistake is assuming Canada is the same country it was the last time he renegotiated NAFTA. It isn't. Carney's government has opened deep channels with Europe, accelerated cooperation in Asia, and secured major investment commitments from partners in the Gulf, all while tightening Canada's industrial base at home. The U.S. may still be Canada's largest trading partner, but it is no longer the only path to growth. And that makes Trump's tariffs dramatically less effective than advertised. Another subtle but devastating point emerged when Carney discussed the pace of negotiations. The United States is waiting for a Supreme Court ruling on whether Trump's tariff machinery is even constitutional. That ruling could reshape the entire foundation of Trump's economic strategy. Meanwhile, Canada loses nothing by waiting. Carney framed patience not as hesitation but as strategic discipline, and the logic is clear. Why negotiate from a position of uncertainty when the legal ground under Washington itself may shift in a matter of months? This is not stalling, it is calculated advantage. Trump is stuck in a holding pattern, forced to defend a system whose durability he cannot guarantee. Carney, by contrast, is free to strengthen Canada's leverage in real time.
Carney also turned the politically charged pipeline discussion into a surprisingly sharp message about economic independence. He clarified that the agreement with Alberta is not a green light for immediate construction, but the creation of conditions under which a project could even be proposed. And then he added the sentence that rewired the entire conversation. Having another pipeline to the United States is less advantageous. In one move, he undercut the assumption that Washington can always use energy dependency to corner Ottawa. The message was simple. A pipeline to American markets is no longer the strategic victory it once was. Canada wants new buyers. Canada wants diversified access. Canada wants leverage, not another lifeline through the United States. Trump cannot use oil politics as a bargaining chip against a country that is deliberately reducing its exposure to his market.
The most surprising revelation came when Carney argued that Canada now has a real opportunity to leapfrog the United States in clean energy, industrial policy, and next-generation manufacturing. While Trump has spent the past year dismantling renewable projects, freezing offshore wind, and pulling back from long-term climate commitments, Canada has been stitching together a national clean electricity strategy, expanding nuclear, accelerating carbon capture frameworks, and preparing industries for the global low-carbon marketplace. Carney was not making a moral argument, he was making an economic one. Competitive markets are moving toward cleaner, lower carbon production, and countries that align early will dominate future supply chains. If the United States chooses to sit out this transition, Canada will not follow it off that cliff. This is where the interview delivered one of its boldest truths. The question is no longer whether Canada can keep up with American industrial dominance. Carney is preparing for a future in which Canada pulls ahead because the U.S. has chosen a slower, narrower, and more politically constrained path. Carney's comments also signaled a new phase in Canada's role on the world stage. Instead of treating global engagement as a defensive necessity, he described it as a proactive strategy. Countries across Asia, Europe, and the Gulf are now seeking deeper ties with Canada, precisely because the U.S. has become unpredictable. This shift benefits Canada not just economically, but diplomatically, giving Ottawa greater influence in coalitions and multilateral agreements that Washington is increasingly absent from. This is the opposite of Trump's narrative that Canada is isolated or dependent. In reality, it is the United States that is losing partners, while Canada is gaining them. Carney's interview wasn't about sparring with Trump, and that is exactly why it landed so forcefully. Without a hint of aggression, he demonstrated that Canada is not only weathering the trade war, but quietly turning it into a strategic advantage. The country is diversifying its economy, strengthening its alliances, and reducing its exposure to American volatility. The result is a North American relationship Trump never prepared for, a Canada that sets its own pace, protects its own interests, and refuses to negotiate from weakness. The real question going into 2026 isn't whether Canada can withstand Trump's next move. It's whether Trump can withstand a Canada that has stopped waiting for permission to lead. Because after this interview, one thing is undeniable. The United States is no longer holding the upper hand. Canada is.
Potash was the top mineral exported to the United States in 2024, largely coming from this deposit in Western Canada, with a total value of $4.2 billion.
It would be hard to imagine. Again, difficult to know exactly where President Trump will be going in this, but hard to imagine that with something like fertilizer and potash, that there would be a risk really to U.S. farmers in the context of something like this. They need our potash. It is one of the things that can't be produced in a way in the United States.
Donald Trump has just repeated the biggest trade mistake of his presidency. Except this time, the consequences are far worse. After threatening very severe tariffs on Canadian potash, analysts immediately warned that American farmers could face a new wave of bankruptcies. In 2018, Trump's tariffs on China crushed U.S. soybean exports and forced Washington to bail out farmers with billions in emergency aid. But now he's targeting fertilizer itself, the one input every crop in America depends on. This isn't just a policy error. This is Trump holding his own farmers hostage in a negotiation they never asked for. And Canada is the adult in the room watching the U.S. repeat history, only this time with even higher stakes.
The latest confrontation erupted when Trump said he was considering harsh new tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, especially potash, the mineral that fuels global food production and remains the backbone of Saskatchewan's economy. The comment came despite the fact that earlier this year, the White House was forced to scale back fertilizer duties after U.S. farmers revolted, warning that rising costs were pushing them toward insolvency. Yet here Trump is again, threatening the same sector that feeds his political base. What makes this explosive is simple. Potash isn't like steel or aluminum. The United States imports nearly 90% of its potash, and about 80% of that comes from Canada. There is no domestic alternative. Saskatchewan alone supplies more potash than the entire United States could ever produce. Scott Moe's reaction captured the absurdity. He urged calm, reminding Canadians to take the president seriously, not literally. Meanwhile, trade expert Jacques Shore stated the uncomfortable truth. America needs Canadian potash because it cannot produce enough of its own. And all of this is happening just months before the 2026 CUSMA review, a moment when cooler heads should prevail, but instead, Washington is lighting matches near dry grass.
To understand the danger of Trump's potash threat, we only need to rewind to 2018. Back then, Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on China. Beijing responded by halting purchases of U.S. soybeans, devastating farmers across the Midwest. The fallout was immediate. Prices collapsed, storage bins overflowed, and the White House had to pay tens of billions in bailout money to keep farms from failing. But the potash situation is fundamentally different and far more dangerous. If Trump hits Canadian potash, America cannot simply find another customer the way China did. There is no alternative supplier. Russia and Belarus are geopolitical non-options, and no other nation on Earth can fill Canada's role. When soybeans lost an export market, farmers suffered. When fertilizers become unaffordable, crops fail. The entire U.S. food system is at risk, from grain to vegetables to livestock feed. In 2018, Trump triggered a farm crisis. In 2025, he is flirting with a food production crisis. Farmers remember the last time Trump gambled with their livelihoods. They know how that story ended, and they know that this time, the consequences will not be limited to soybeans. It will hit every acre of American soil.
Here is the most revealing part. Canada is not the one escalating. Trump is using American farmers as leverage for the upcoming CUSMA-USMCA 2026 negotiations, squeezing his own domestic base to pressure Ottawa into concessions. Canada, meanwhile, has remained steady, pragmatic, and diplomatic. Trump, by contrast, is treating American agriculture as a bargaining chip. The people who will suffer first are not politicians. It's the producers in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, people already battling drought, rising fuel costs, and inflation. Farm groups across the Midwest have quietly, and in some cases very publicly, warned the White House that fertilizer tariffs are economically suicidal. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe said the same thing in more diplomatic language. Canada does not need to escalate because the U.S. Farm Belt will do the job for them. In other words, Trump is threatening Canada. But he is hurting Americans.
Canada's strength in this conflict comes from something simple. It didn't cause it. Canadian producers didn't start a tariff war. Canadian politicians didn't weaponize agriculture. Canada is acting like a stable trading nation, and the world sees it. Nutrien, the country's largest fertilizer company, is expanding export capacity and exploring new global routes. European and Asian buyers are lining up for long-term supply deals.
Canada is diversifying markets in anticipation of U.S. volatility. Meanwhile, America is walking into the 2026 review with a slowing economy, high food prices, and farm communities exhausted from years of political whiplash. Canada is entering CUSMA calm and prepared. Trump is entering desperate for leverage. And the more he threatens potash, the more leverage he hands to Ottawa.
This is the political irony. The states most loyal to Trump will be the first to feel the pain. Potash price spikes hit fertilizer. Fertilizer costs hit corn and soybeans. Higher feed costs hit livestock producers. And all of it hits rural families who already operate on razor-thin margins. When fertilizer spikes, grocery store prices spike too, and voters notice. This isn't a blue state problem or a red state problem. It's a national problem created by a president who keeps treating trade like a reality TV stunt. Democrats will weaponize it. Republican governors will panic. Farmers will revolt. And Canada will continue exporting potash while the U.S. experiences another self-inflicted crisis. Trump's threat to place new tariffs on Canadian potash is not just another trade skirmish. It is the second act of a story America should have already learned from. The soybean disaster of 2018 was the preview. The potash crisis of 2025 is the sequel. But this time, the damage won't be limited to one crop or one region. It will hit the entire food chain. Canada is not the antagonist in this story. Canada is the stable supplier, the responsible partner, and the adult in the room. The real crisis is that American farmers are being forced once again to pay the political price for Trump's tariff theatrics. And unlike 2018, there is no bailout big enough to replace the potash Canada provides. So the question isn't whether Canada can withstand a tariff. The question is whether American farmers can survive being used as bargaining chips one more time. And based on history, they can't.
So Microsoft is putting big bucks into Canadian AI. Today, the American company announced a $19 billion investment into expanding Canada's AI sector over a 5-year period. It comes as concerns about Canada's digital sovereignty are growing.
Canada just saw something no one ever expected. A major American corporation went on national television to reassure Canadians because the relationship between Ottawa and Washington has deteriorated so badly under Donald Trump. Microsoft's vice chair appeared not to promote a product, not to announce a simple business expansion, but to effectively apologize on behalf of the United States and promise that Canada could trust his company even if it could no longer trust its closest neighbor. When a U.S. tech giant steps into the role usually reserved for diplomats, it tells us one thing very clearly. Canada's patience with Trump's America has run out, and American companies know it.
It's a year where we appreciate a level of frustration in Canada. We are investing more, $19 billion over 5 years, $7.5 billion in the next 2 years. Right. We want Canada to know that despite whatever issues arise between our two governments, the Canadian people can depend on Microsoft.
Microsoft has announced a staggering $19 billion investment into Canada's AI and cloud future. Brad Smith, the company's vice chair and president, traveled to Ottawa to meet key ministers and soon Prime Minister Mark Carney. But the real story wasn't the money. It was the tone. In his interview, Smith acknowledged that this has been a difficult year for the Canada-U.S. relationship and that Microsoft understands the frustration in Canada. It was an unusual moment. An American executive openly validating Canadian concerns about the behavior of the U.S. government. Smith laid out a detailed plan to protect Canada's digital sovereignty. He said Canadian data will remain in Canadian territory. He said Microsoft will encrypt information so securely that even if another government managed to seize it, it would be unreadable. And then came the line that stunned many viewers. Microsoft, if necessary, will go to court to defend Canadian data against the United States. He reminded Canadians that the company has sued both the Obama and the Trump administrations before, including taking cases all the way to the Supreme Court, and that it is prepared to do so again if Canada's sovereignty is threatened. Smith spoke with the tone of someone drawing a boundary, a promise that the political chaos in Washington would not interfere with Canadian rights, Canadian customers, or Canadian control over their own digital future.
The fact that Microsoft needed to make this intervention says everything about the moment we're living in. The United States, under Trump's second term, has become an unpredictable actor. Reuters, AP, and CBC have all documented the instability. Sudden tariffs on Canadian metals and autos, abrupt threats to tear up trade agreements, and a flurry of executive orders used to pressure allies and industries. Canadian officials privately described the environment as volatile, and Canada's ambassador to Washington recently resigned ahead of the 2026 CUSMA review because the relationship had become nearly impossible to manage. Against that backdrop, Microsoft's reassurance made perfect sense. Trump has created so much uncertainty that even U.S. companies are trying to calm Canada down. And Canada's response, whether stated directly or hinted through policy, is increasingly the same. If Washington can no longer be trusted, then Canada will build systems that do not depend on Washington at all. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been clear since taking office that Canada needs to secure its digital future. His government has accelerated clean electricity expansion, modernized cybersecurity rules, attracted global tech investment, and put digital sovereignty at the center of national strategy. Companies like Microsoft are not just buying servers and building data centers, they are attaching themselves to a country that is stable, predictable, powered by clean energy, and governed by institutions that behave rationally, the exact opposite of the political turbulence in Washington. There is also a broader geopolitical undercurrent. Trump's use of executive authority is far more aggressive in his second term. Canadian officials and journalists have raised concerns that the president could try to use data access the same way he has used tariffs, as a bargaining chip. Smith acknowledged this fear without saying Trump's name directly. He emphasized Microsoft's constant communication with the White House as if to reassure viewers that he is trying to prevent escalation before it happens. And then he delivered the real message. If Trump tries to weaponize data the way he has weaponized trade, Microsoft will not comply. That is a stunning declaration. A multinational corporation is drawing a line between itself and the President of the United States because it sees more long-term value in siding with Canada. It reinforces an emerging pattern visible throughout 2025. Global capital is shifting north. Investors are looking for stability. Technology companies want clean energy and predictable regulation. Nations in Europe and Asia increasingly view Canada as a safe anchor, while the U.S. political environment becomes more erratic. Trump wanted to make America the center of global industry again. Instead, his unpredictability is pushing allies, money, and innovation toward Canada. And Canada, far from being a passive observer, is seizing the moment. Carney's government is positioning the country as a global leader in energy, AI, critical minerals, and cybersecurity. Microsoft's investment is not charity. It is a bet on Canada's trajectory, a bet that Canada will be a more stable and successful hub for the next quarter century than the United States under Trump. What's even more telling is how other countries and companies are responding to the same climate of instability. European partners have begun shifting long-term research initiatives into Canada. Asian investors are expanding clean tech operations in Alberta and Ontario. Even US-based multinationals have quietly increased hiring in Canadian tech hubs because the political risk is lower. All of this reinforces one simple truth. Canada is becoming the safe harbor in a turbulent geopolitical era, a role the United States used to play.
When an American corporation tells Canadians, you can depend on us even when you can't depend on your neighbor, the old idea of an unshakable Canada-US partnership is gone. Microsoft's $19 billion investment is more than a business decision. It is a statement about power, trust, and the new geography of innovation. It is a recognition that Canada is no longer simply an extension of the U.S. tech market, but a sovereign digital nation with the leverage to attract global players on its own terms. Trump did not intend to strengthen Canada, but through instability, he has done exactly that. And the question now is whether this shift marks a temporary detour or the beginning of a long era in which Canada becomes the Western world's stable alternative to Washington's volatility.
If U.S. allies and U.S. companies continue turning to Canada for certainty, then the center of North American leadership may be moving north faster than anyone expected. Canada may not have asked for this moment, but it is rising to meet it, and in a world shaped by technological power, data security, and global competition, the nation that others trust most will be the one that leads. Right now, increasingly, that nation is Canada.